Hola amigos, qué gusto saludarles en otro Viernes de Disrupción. Como ustedes saben, Viernes de Disrupción es una propuesta que hace la Asociación Civil Un Estado de Derecho en alianza con Universidad Fundación y tenemos por fin enseñar el derecho desde una perspectiva, desde una posición distinta, más amplia, interdisciplinaria, también empírica, experimental y sin duda mucho más libre. Hoy vamos a hablar sobre derechos humanos y en especial sobre el derecho a la educación. Y bueno, tenemos a la autoridad en este tema. Tenemos al profesor James Tooley. Además me acompañan hoy acá en el aula Mariana Escolaro y Leonardo Verónico, ambos son miembros de un Estado de Derecho. Están investigando sobre educación en Venezuela de la mano con el profesor James Tooley. Y bueno, vamos a tener una buena conversación sobre el Bello Árbol, ese viaje personal del profesor Tooley que ya nos va a contar. James, I'm so happy to share with you today. And let's talk about your book, your work.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here today. Thank you for inviting me, and greetings to everyone watching this today. My work, my passion for the last 2 decades, or even longer, has been this extraordinary phenomenon of low-cost private schools. And now many people around the world have heard of these. 20 years ago, 21 years ago, when I wandered into the slums of Hyderabad in South Central India, no one had heard of these in the West. No one had heard of this in England or America. And I was surprised when I first wandered into a school and found that it was a private school, a little school down a little alleyway in some slums. And then I found another school, another. And soon I was connected to a federation of some 500 of these low-cost private schools. And to me, it was an extraordinary finding about the spirit of human enterprise and the spirit of human endurance. Because the parents I spoke to sending their children to these schools, of course I asked, why are you sending your children to private schools when the government schools are free, when the government schools give you free lunch, sometimes free books, and the government school is in a nice building, whereas the schools you're sending to are not so nice? And I asked parents this, and typically the word came back, the sense came back, in the government schools, our children are abandoned. And I went to see one of the government schools myself, just to see what was going on. And I went with the district education officer. So they knew we were coming. We were announced. And in the first class I went to see, a sight I will never, ever forget, there were 130 children sitting on the floor of this little classroom amongst the mosquitoes, young children, all eager. What do we call them? Bushy-eyed, just eager to learn, eager to greet this stranger coming in. 130 children there. And I asked, why so many? And they said, well, normally there should be a whole load of children. I think it was a whole load of teachers. I think 7 teachers should be here. Today, only 2 teachers are here. So we group all the children together. Today, only 2 children, but every day. Today, only 2 teachers, but every day, only 2 teachers. That's all who could come and be bothered. Yes, the children were abandoned. And I just thought this sight really moved me, seeing how children were in the government schools and comparing them with the extraordinarily lively learning going on in the private schools. And to me, I had an epiphany, actually, you know, one of these times where bits of my life came together, because before that, I had, for various reasons, become an expert on private education. And private education, as everyone knows, before this work, private education is about the elite or the upper classes, those who are wealthy. And I didn't want to be just focused on the wealthy. I wanted to be focused on the poor for whatever reason. I wanted to be about improving human flourishing, not serving the wealthy. And so, having found these low-cost private schools serving poor communities, I suddenly realized that actually my life could be complete. I could work in the low-cost private schools, helping them, discovering more about them, and still focused on improving the lot of humanity. So after that first visit in Hyderabad, I went back to Washington, D.C., where I was doing consultancy for the International Finance Corporation. And I said, something amazing is going on. You should see all these hundreds of private schools. And they said, calm down, Tooley. You've just maybe seen a few business people ripping off the poor. And I thought, well, that's not what I've seen. That's not what I've seen at all. I've seen individuals committed to learning, spending their weekends in sports fairs, arts and science fairs. And so I then managed to raise money from the John Templeton Foundation to explore this phenomenon around the world. And I did research, first of all, in Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, India, several parts of India, and rural China. And in each of the urban communities, I found the same phenomenon. The majority of school children, the majority of poor school children, and when I say the majority, 70, 75, 80% of school children were in these low-cost private schools. These low-cost private schools outperformed the government schools. They did it at a price that was affordable to parents on the poverty line. They were fair to girls, and they were run as businesses, so they were a fully sustainable. They lived only on the student fees, the fees that were attracted. They didn't require philanthropy. They didn't require outsiders, government coming in. They were not subsidized. So therefore, they were a fully sustainable and scalable model for providing alternative, good education, excellent education to all families, not just the elites. The children, why did they go there? The parents chose these schools. They could list the qualities in these goods in the private schools that were better than the qualities in the government schools. They could just list them. They could easily say, yes, these schools are safer for girls. These schools look after the children more. The teaching is better. And the only things that the government schools are better for, I would ask, and they say, well, they have more strikes, more teacher strikes. And sometimes they would have better buildings. So I did all that research. All that's reported in the beautiful tree that we'll talk about, that we're talking about the book. And then there was one criticism that I took seriously. People said, okay, you've done this research in Ghana, Nigeria, India, but these are not the world's most difficult places. How can you say private education is good for the poor when there are worse places and we don't know what's going on there? I took that seriously. And so I got another grant from the John Templeton Foundation to look at Liberia, Sierra Leone, South Sudan, a bit in Somaliland, looking at this phenomenon in war-torn countries in Africa. And what did we find? We found almost exactly the same. In the slums of Monrovia in Liberia, 71% of poor children are going to private schools. Same picture in Sierra Leone, Freetown, same picture in Juba in South Sudan. This extraordinary phenomenon, maybe even a higher percentage in Somaliland. The phenomenon is there. So we can say private education is good for the poor. Private education reaches the parts no one else can reach. And it emerges spontaneously all over the world when the conditions are right, when you've got poor parents who care about their children. Well, that's the majority of poor parents. Poor parents care about their children. The government school is not good enough. Parents want the accountability of private schools. I commend this sector to you, Antonio. It's an exciting sector. And I know you've been excited by it and been doing some work in Venezuela. I'd love to talk more.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Professor Tooley, for sharing that with us. We definitely felt inspired, beyond inspired, when we read both The Beautiful Tree and Education, War and Peace. And we just couldn't stop thinking and asking ourselves, is this also happening in Venezuela or in Latin America in general? Especially in Venezuela, with our current situation, that we have this, what we call a complex humanitarian emergency. So we kept asking, could be this really happening here as well in this some difficult context? And also considering that could be a possibility because you actually found that phenomenon in war-torn countries. So we then stopped asking just ourselves and we start asking around, right? And we, at the beginning, we had those same reactions that you have of people just in disbelief and telling us that was just private schools for elite students or other social classes. But we kept digging, and as you know, we found in just a period of 3 weeks, over 50 schools around the country, low-cost private schools run by the community itself, and charging even less than $1 per month. And people just preferring going to these schools over the public school they had in front of their houses at the corner of their community for the exact same reasons. However, people keep doubting, keep saying, well, but how about the poorest of the poorest? How about if people cannot afford even less than $1 per month, especially in an economy with an hyperinflation like Venezuela? And we wanted to ask you, what do you keep saying to those people that still don't believe? And even after your 2 books that you arranged and got to demonstrate that both in poor countries and in poor countries torn by war, this is happening and this works better than public school. But what do you keep saying to people that, you know, keep telling you this is not going to work, this is not a long-term solution, we maybe have to try something else with better government? So what do you keep telling people? So what's your response after even the 2nd book and people that you get to know in a daily basis?
Yeah, so obviously I don't know about your situation in Venezuela, which could be slightly different, although I'm so excited that you found those 50 schools, the low-cost private schools. You went looking, just as I did 20 years ago, wandering into poor neighborhoods and finding those schools. But you know, there could be differences in Venezuela, hyperinflation and so on, all these things you described. So let me just focus on what I do know about, let's say, sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, and see what similarities there are. So the interesting thing is, you mentioned this denial. Everyone denied the existence of these schools. And for a few years, that was the response I got, almost as if I was just lying about these schools, you know, as if I would lie. But there was that very skeptical response. But then once people started coming and I would show people, and then I did some, you know, small films about these, and I published, and people got to know them all. So they could no longer deny their existence in those countries. They could then deny their existence in other countries. So they would, you know, when I first went to Sierra Leone, Liberia, South Sudan, I was told, well, you found it in Ghana, Kenya, and Nigeria. You won't find it in these countries. Of course, I did. But then they denied their significance. And this is the very important point you raised, Mariana. This is the very important point you raised. The denial then is of their significance. And one of the things is, yes, but the poorest of the poor cannot afford these schools. So my response to that is probably twofold. One is sending a child to a government school is also not free. We always have the sense that it's free, but sending a child to a government school is also not free. I've done a lot of work on this, published articles on this, because there are always the additional costs of schooling, which are found even in the government schools. So even if the government schools have no fees, even if they have no fees at all, and often in government schools you get some informal levies, building levies or whatever, but even if there was nothing, sending a child to government school, you still need to buy, if you're living in a poor area, you need to buy shoes, you need to buy uniform, you need to buy books, you need to buy lunch, you need to have transport. And all these additional costs of sending a child to a government school are roughly the same as sending a child to a low-cost private school. Those costs are not any different overall. This is the research we've shown. So if you add those costs, which are the same, and then add on the fees, what my research has shown is that the cost of sending a child to a government school is about 75% of sending a child to a low-cost private school. So it's not free. It's more to a private school. I'm not saying it's not more, but it's not free to send to a government school either. And then, of course, you get more attention in the private school. You get more hours. So the parent can go out working for longer. The government school might only be open 3 or 4 hours. The private school is open 5 or 6 hours. So there are opportunity costs of time to be thrown in. So that's the first thing. That's the first answer. No, Government schools are not there for the poorest of the poor either. They are not affordable either. And then secondly, I'd say, okay, well, if we're concerned about that, then let's get either government or philanthropic measures, or both, to provide vouchers, scholarships for those children to attend the private schools. Let's not say the government schools are not good enough. Poor parents are saying they're not good enough. So if there's money going into that sector, let's instead give the money to parents so that they can send their children to these schools. So there are two solutions, and there's two solutions that are working around the world. But that's a long answer to your question, but you can ask, you can come back on bits that you want me to elaborate on.
Well, Professor Tooley, I would like to be emphatic in one thing you said, that when you come to people, normally experts on public policy, on education, on international cooperation, when you go to them with those findings, and you said, I think that they don't pay more attention to it. They keep denying what you say. We would like to go deep on those reactions. What are those reactions? Firstly, when you can go those first findings, when you begin this investigation and you can say, well, this is happening in all these countries, and they say, well, this is not happening here, or this is not happening in that country. That was the first reaction. What are the reactions right now when you have all those findings? What those people on the World Bank or in governments keep telling you right now?
Yeah, no. So now that denial can no longer exist. It's no longer viable to have that denial. Everyone, you can still deny about particular places, like, had I asked about Venezuela because no research had been done, people would say, oh, Venezuela, no. Now we know there are. But so you can have denial about specific locations, but in general, no, the denial can't work now. So the denial of the significance, but no, a lot of people have come, a lot of organizations, at least for a while, have come round to thinking the low-cost private schools are going to be a vehicle for education for all. So it's not quite as negative as it used to be. So now you have, people in the International Finance Corporation, private arm of the World Bank. You've got different parts of even the UN. You've got the American USAID. You've got the British DFID, and even European groups. All at some point over the last 10 years since I first wrote about it, they have now got involved in some way in seeing if they can assist the private schools. Now, there is a backlash against that, and you may have heard of this thing called the Abidjan principles. The Abidjan, of course, is the capital of Côte d'Ivoire in West Africa. Groups of NGOs and lawyers, they got together to create these Abidjan principles, which were really trying to stop, or at least hinder, the international agencies coming in and assisting with the low-cost private schools. So that there's a sort of bit of to and froing. And of course, one difficulty is international agencies can say they want to help these poor schools and help with these communities, but actually it's quite hard to help. And often they will come in and even hinder what's going on in these places. Like, for example, in Nigeria, in Lagos, DFID, the British International Aid Agency, the government aid agency, they were very impressed, very excited about the low-cost private schools. And so what did they do? They came in and they funded one American chain. They gave them $5 million to come in and compete with all the other schools. I mean, this was just the existing schools. No, this was just completely the wrong way, So it's almost better if they just stayed out. They put 5 million into one chain and then just distorted the market and forced schools to close and so on. So in some ways, it's a mixed blessing if people do want to get involved. Sometimes it's best to let this, this very organic, this very spontaneous order, just to let it get on and achieve what it can achieve. Because I'll give you some numbers. In India, an estimate is there's probably 450,000 low-cost private schools, India alone. In Nigeria, in Lagos state, one state of Nigeria, there are probably 14,000 low-cost private schools. And in other states across Nigeria, similar numbers. This has grown and prospered, survived? No, prospered without anyone getting involved. And that's a very important thing. So we should be careful what we wish for sometimes. If they become on people's agendas, first of all, they come on people's agendas and then people try and stop them, like the Abidjan principles, or they come on people's agendas and then they come in and wade into the market and distort it, like that case in Lagos. So sometimes we should be careful what we wish for.
Definitely. And you were talking about school vouchers before, and I wanted to follow up on that question and mixing it together with the still skeptical reactions and denial. So what's the reaction, or what's the comeback, if any, when you propose these school vouchers? Or even have you even tried to implement school vouchers at all after your research? And what would you say to people that are even skeptical to this measure? I put you an example. People say here in Venezuela, well, but what about if the government doesn't even have, in this situation, the budget to allocate to education? Where that funding is going to come from for school vouchers to directly fund people? Yes, but where's the money, especially in a situation where we are in a complex humanitarian emergency, or even after war situations, that economy is completely destroyed?
No, I think this is a really good question, and I was quite careful to phrase my answer just now. I said there are a couple of possibilities, and one possibility is, and I think I said government or philanthropy funded vouchers, and that's a possibility. I'm not actually particularly in favor of vouchers, and I've actually just written a new book called Really Good Schools, where there's a chapter on vouchers and why Milton Friedman changed his mind about certain things. And the problem there is, look, we often hear about school vouchers, and of course the Milton Friedman model of vouchers is universal vouchers, where everyone gets the vouchers and they can then, and it's for democratic reasons, so everyone can access schooling. But nowhere in the world has that been tried properly. Now, in Chile, in South America, and Sweden in Europe, there's some sort of some move towards that. Those are the only two countries that have been tried. In the USA, we often think of America, the United States of America, as being thriving with vouchers. Do you know, I did the calculation for this new book, and it's less than 0.5% of school children have access to vouchers. This is so far from being universal. And why isn't it? Well, I followed through a few voucher programs in the United States of America, and great programs, wonderful ideas, committed people bring it forward, and frequently, generally, often they are stopped by the teacher unions. The teacher unions stop these because they see them as a threat. And that's really my biggest concern, why I don't keep saying about vouchers wherever I go, because I believe that in all the countries I work in, the teacher unions would stop them or distort them, or they would they'd be so reduced, by vested interests controlling them, they wouldn't be valuable. And so I would much rather have, actually, an answer to your question now, I would much rather say, let's focus first of all on the fact that the poorest can't afford them at the moment, but not that different from government schools. How can we bring the price down? How can we bring the price down even more? And maybe there are ways of doing that. And then we look at the philanthropic side, creating scholarships for those children. And we look to our society in general as well. Some problems education can't solve. The society has to start solving those problems first. And so sometimes, you just have to accept that we can't get the perfect system straight away. We have to allow for some development time. But yeah, how can we get the cost down even more? And maybe we can. Maybe we've learned lessons over periods of lockdown where we can realize you can reduce costs even more through technology and through different methods.
Mr. Tooley, taking into consideration that last phrase, that last answer you just said, we have read and we have talked about education in the poorest places on the world, the hardest places in the world. But talking about educational vouchers and the liberalization or kind of liberalization of education taking out from the government and making more private initiatives to be viable. I would like to ask you what's your opinion regarding education in those places where it may seem that right now public education is working. Developing places like European countries, maybe the United States of America. What can we say when, for example, we have those problems when people say, well, education on Iceland works, education on France, public education on France is working right now. What can we try to take those good practice from them and try to copy here in Venezuela? We have other answers to that because, well, we have not the money that France or Iceland have, and that's like obvious, but
Yeah.
maybe some good practice may be copied here. What is your opinion regarding that?
Yes. Okay. And first of all, I do want to just stress in sort of to my earlier answers, I was sort of sounding as if these schools now, I was making them sound unaffordable. No, to most families, these schools are affordable. And I've done this research showing the affordability for families on or even below the poverty line, because there is a whole range of price of these low-cost private schools. They're a very flexible market. So they are affordable to most, not to everyone. Not everyone can afford government schools either. But in answer to your question then, this is, first of all, we can always say the education in France, Germany, Iceland, I think you said, we can always say those are working, but there's always a missing counterfactual, isn't it? We never know what education would be like if the state hadn't got involved. Now this is, and I'm not sort of boasting, any super knowledge here, but that's an important question, because if you have government imposed education, you've had it imposed in England, for example, for 151 years now, 151 years, there's a missing counterfactual, so we don't know what would have happened. But then we can look at any other areas where governments have a near monopoly, and then the government, it gets privatized, and then you see how things develop in much more exciting ways than they may have done before the government monopoly was broken. Telephones are a really good answer. Telephones have been a government monopoly even in my country until not that long ago. They were released from that, and then of course the whole the world of mobile telephony and all the rest of it was brought in, and very exciting. So if we were still with government telephones, we could say, well, they work and they work okay, but we can't compare. There's no counterfactual. That's the first answer. The second answer is actually a historical one, because why did governments get involved in these places? And without being, I don't want to go down too much of a conspiracy theory road now, but it's pretty clear that it was the Prussians that started this whole idea of government schooling, and they got involved for military and industrial might. They got involved in order to train proper workers for their factories and for their armies. Under Napoleon in France, that's why they got involved, to create that military and industrial might. And in England, why did we get involved? Because we were, well, one reason was perhaps because we were wanting to keep up with the French and the Germans. But what happened when we got involved? There was a government survey called the Newcastle Commission of 1861 in England and Wales. And it was a very careful, a very thorough survey. By this time, government was giving some subsidies to schools, but mostly it was still non-government. There were some subsidies, mostly non-government. They found schools were run by churches, by philanthropists, but also half of the schools were what they called, and it was their language at the time, for-profit private schools. Those for-profit private schools were the low-cost private schools of Victorian England. And they found 95% of children were in schools before the government got involved, with only some subsidies. And so they proposed, when government got involved, that it shouldn't come in and stamp out the sector. No, that it come in and work alongside this sector, and that it should do a survey of an area, try and provide for that 5%, try and mop up those who are not able to come into state schools, maybe extend the time in private schools, maybe extend the time in education, because they were 95% were in for an average of about 6 years, or maybe you needed 7 years, 8 years, fine. Government got involved for those reasons, but government got involved and stamped it all out. That's one thing. So historically, did we need government to get universal education? In the United States, in the States, and in England and Wales? No. What about the counterfactual? What would it be like without government intervention? Well, that's interesting. We don't know, but look at other sectors. But the third thing is this: you said education works. Education works for who? In England, when I talked in America and England, I was often asked this question. You found this in developing countries. You found this in the global South. Why isn't it in America, in the United States? Why isn't it in England? And I often had some answer, well, perhaps the schooling isn't bad enough. Perhaps it's not as bad as it was. People aren't as dissatisfied, or they're more used to the state. But anyway, I didn't travel for a while in England, 3 or 4 years ago. And I decided to start a low-cost private school in the north of England. I was based at Newcastle, and I opened one with local partners in 2 or 3 years ago. A low-cost private school. It's called the Independent Grammar School, Durham, IGS Durham, and it was really, so this isn't low cost like the ones you see. It's not $1 a month, but it's still half of the cost of the per capita funding that goes into the state school. It's 1/5 of the price of normal private schools. And people told me, you're completely mad, Tooley. You're mad. Why are you doing this? How can you do it for 1/5 of the cost of the other private schools? How can you do it for half of the cost of the state schools? Because the state schools are always complaining, the government schools, how little money they have, how broke they are. And I was really flattered, though, because the teacher unions took this seriously. They started picketing all of our parent meetings. They started picketing our early days at school. They were afraid. They knew this was relevant. The school is still small, less than 100 kids. The first day I had two children at school. I nearly packed it in. But my business partners, we kept going. The school has reached break even. It's passed all the regulatory measures that the government requires, come out with good flying colors. It's now got a permission to extend into higher schools. And this is a long answer to your question. Parents sending their children to the school say, yes, the government schools are fine. They're fine for your children and their children. They're not fine for my children. They're not good enough, because my child is very bright and they don't extend the child. My child needs special help and doesn't get it. My child has special needs, or actually I as a parent don't like the things that are going on in the government schools. I don't like it. And I don't even have to tell you why I don't like it. I just don't like it. And I want more control and accountability. And that's why they're sending the children to this low-cost school. And I believe this market can extend. I believe it will happen in America. And that's what I talk about in my new book, Really Good Schools. This can happen in America too. This can happen in England. And maybe the coronavirus lockdowns, the lockdowns due to coronavirus, they have increased in parents' minds the realization that government schools aren't good enough. Because there's lots of research now showing private schools have responded better to children's education during lockdown. Government schools neglected them. And there's other research showing parents have had experience of homeschooling. They embrace it, but they actually don't want to do it full time, but they wouldn't mind some help with it. So smaller academies can grow. So very long answer to your question, but it's quite a nuanced question there. And I think there are lots of reasons to say this could be a universal phenomenon if freedom is allowed.
Thank you so much for that, new information also about your book. Definitely, I think Antonio in his closing remarks, we'll mention some about it. But my last question for this segment will be actually expanding a little bit more on what you said. You said you created a local school in North England. So we wanted to ask you what has been your work, or after your research on the field, what has been your work? Have you been creating more schools around the countries you have visited? And even more, what are the next steps for James Tooley in this area, especially taking in account what you just mentioned about coronavirus? Has you been thinking of a change of direction, or even innovating even more how to respond to these new challenges that definitely the virus and the lockdown has created, and how to implement that into this new proposal, new way to see education, and how it could be improved even in these scarce with scarce resources and challenging context.
Yeah, okay. So my own situation, so I'll just describe it a little bit about what I've done in terms of creating school chains and federations and so on, always with local partners. And then start with where I am now, because I've now become the Vice Chancellor of the University of Buckingham. You can see the screen behind me. And in a sense, I'm an accidental Vice Chancellor, because the University of Buckingham is proudly independent. It's staunchly private. And I've always wanted to come here, from one of the state universities, come here, do my work. And I came here a year and a half, 2 years ago, to create a Centre for Education Entrepreneurship, which would really focus on the low-cost private schools and developments along these lines and new innovations. And then for various reasons, I got into this position where they wanted me as Vice Chancellor, and I sort of reluctantly accepted. And of course, Vice Chancellor, that's the English term, but that means the president of the university, the CEO. So I got I'm very much caught up in running this at the moment. I am now in a position where I will create that Centre for Educational Entrepreneurship, which I came to create here. There's an advert out for the director of that centre to take on my role. I think the closing date is in a couple of days' time. So you must, any of your listeners, if there's still time, must see that, and I would accept late applications from your part of the world. So I want to create that, and that will really be focused on continuing to research-based advocacy, teaching, creating programs based on low-cost private schools and other initiatives that we can have around that spirit of educational enterprise. So that's what I'm doing now and the future. But throughout my time, so once I'd done the research, I did take about 5 years unpaid leave from Newcastle University, where I was based, and I lived in various parts in India and Ghana and Uganda, to help create with local partners some chains of these schools. So based on the principle that a single school that you get would not necessarily be able to invest in teacher training, curriculum development. But if you get a chain of these schools, 20, 30, 40 of these schools, 100, then you can actually invest in real improvements in those, because the little bit of surplus from one school multiplied 100 times is a lot of surplus, and you'd be able to attract investors. So I did a few of those, and I've had mixed success. Some of the school chains in India are going well. So the school chains in West Africa, Omega Schools was recently acquired by another chain called Rising Academies. That's going well enough, although of course the COVID lockdowns meant all these school chains have been closed for a while. In India, school chains have been closed for the whole year. A whole year of lockdown. They were the first to close and the last to reopen. And in India, as you know, there's increasing problems now. So I was excited by those, and I learned a lot. I learned a lot about it increased my respect for the entrepreneurs who open these schools. It's much more difficult to build a school than write about building a school. It's much more difficult. So my respect increased no end. And I did come to understand more about the business model, more about the complexity of these schools. And that's helped my research and my writing, I think. but at the moment, I'm involved in a couple of projects where we're trying to bring University of Buckingham teacher training in a very, very low cost way through actually a phone app, because we can't do it in person. So we're doing it online with we created some little learning centers in Nigeria where teachers can come, and there'll be apps or there'll be smartphones or tablets they can use, an internet connection, do their teacher training there, go back to their schools, and mentors can come and visit them at schools. Doing that in Nigeria and India. I'm also trying to raise more money from various groups to look at low-cost private schools in the north of Nigeria. The north of Nigeria, northeast, Boko Haram, these sort of things. There's very difficult places there. I'm hoping I can get some money to do some research there, continue looking at difficult places, continue to think about building that school chain in England or America. And one of the best things that happened over the last few months, you must know this, was when you got in touch from Venezuela and said, you liked my work, you admired it, could we explore in Venezuela too? And that was so thrilling. When you got in touch, you went looking, as I did in the early days, and you found these schools, and you're also excited and thrilled by them. That's been one of the best things that happened to me recently.
Wow. James, like I told you the first time we met, you're my hero, James. I really appreciate your work and all the support you have given us. But I have one question for you, short question. What book do you have on your nightstand, on your bedside table? What are you reading now?
So that's a difficult question to answer, because I took over this job 7 months ago, and I'm at my desk. I've been at my desk now for 11 hours. I've got one more hour to do, and I go home. I'm too tired to read, and on the weekends I still have to work. But there is a book by my desk, by my bed, and it's called Helgoland by the quantum physicist Carlo Rovelli. I guess he's Italian, and he's just this amazing quantum physicist. And he's written this book, which is it's half poetry and it's half quantum mechanics. And it's trying to explain, the extraordinary phenomenon of quantum physics to people like me who are not physicists. It's trying to explain its wonder. And I suppose, I'm only on page 5 or something, I read half a page and I'm asleep, but I want to read it because I think you'll probably agree with me, but I've never lost that inquisitiveness about the world we live in. And, we do our work in certain areas, but the fundamental things that drive us, I think, are things like, what is the meaning of life? What things can we bring in to look at life? Why are we here? So reading quasi-philosophical things like this quantum physicist trying to tell us about the world he sees out there and how that connects to the world we live. These are things I never lose sight of, and I just continue to do. And once I've been in this job a year, I'll be less tired and be able to read more. I may even have finished that book by then.
Well, James, thank you very much for this talk, and see you very soon. Amigos, esto fue Viernes de Disrupción. Gracias, Mariana, Leonardo, por haber compartido acá. James, realmente espero que en Latinoamérica comencemos a ver crecer ese bello árbol del que tú escribes. Ya saben, les recuerdo nuestras redes. Un Estado de Derecho es uedlibertad.org. Allí pueden estar al tanto de lo próximo que vamos a hacer. James, thank you.
Thank you very much. I didn't understand what you said, but thank you very much.
Marianita, Leonardo.
He just said, James, that we all hope to see that beautiful tree grow in Latin America as well.
Yeah.
So that's our hope. That's the passion of our work right now. That's our goal, and that's all has been inspired by your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's wonderful. And as I build this center here, we will have closer collaborations with you, and one day I hope to come and visit myself. That would be wonderful.
Sure.
For sure. Thank you.
Well,
thank you so much for your
James.
interest. It's really, really gratifying to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll stop recording now, and
Oh, right.
okay.